In the span of exactly 24 hours, the air defense network over Ukraine underwent a statistical impossibility. On January 19, 2026, the Russian Federation's missile forces overwhelmed the Ukrainian defenses. They achieved a penetration rate that suggested the total collapse of Kyiv's protective shield. Russian ballistic and cruise missiles struck critical infrastructure with impunity. The interception rate for high-velocity targets was 11%. 11. One day later, on January 20th, against a nearly identical Russian strike package, same volume, same vectors, same warheads, Ukrainian operators achieved a 92% kill rate. This was not a miracle. In the world of military analysis, miracles do not exist. There are only variables: physics, logistics, frequency management, and economics. What occurred between the 19th and the 20th was a violent collision of two distinct philosophies of war. You had the Russian doctrine of brute force saturation interacting with a new layer of Western precision kinetic interception. To understand how Ukraine survived the second wave, we cannot simply look at the headlines or the political rhetoric coming out of Moscow or Kyiv. We must look inside the guidance systems of the interceptors, at the wavelengths of the engagement radars, and at the balance sheets of the warring nations. This is a deep dive into the anomaly. We are going to dissect the specific physics of the Patriot PAC-3 system. We are going to analyze the S-band versus C-band radar spectrum war. And finally, we are going to audit the economic war of attrition that Russia is waging against the Ukrainian treasury. This is not just about missiles. It is about the sustainability of the Ukrainian state against the industrial mass of the Russian Federation. I am your host, and this is Force Ratio. To understand the sudden spike in Ukrainian efficiency, we must first rigorously analyze the threat profile presented by the Russian aerospace forces. The Russian Federation has systematically escalated the complexity of its aerial attacks over the last 4 years of conflict. Russian commanders are no longer simply firing missiles in linear trajectories. They are orchestrating mixed threat volleys, designed specifically to confuse and overwhelm Ukrainian radar operators. On January 19th, the day of failure, the Russian military launched a combination of subsonic cruise missiles, low-cost loitering munitions, and most critically, hypervelocity ballistic missiles. The failure of the 19th was primarily a failure of track management. This is a concept we need to explore technically. Most legacy air defense radars operating in Ukraine were S-band surveillance radars. These are excellent for seeing that something is in the sky at a long distance. They act like a floodlight in a dark room. You can see movement, you can see a swarm. But when Russia launches a saturation attack, they fill the sky with noise. They mix slow, cheap drones with fast, expensive missiles. An S-band radar sees a blob of targets. It gets overwhelmed. It cannot discern the specific trajectory of a hypersonic Iskander missile hiding behind a wall of slow-moving Shahed drones. This is why the interception rate was 11%. The Ukrainian operators were effectively blinded by the volume of data. They couldn't calculate a firing solution fast enough because their sensors were saturated with noise. But on January 20th, the electromagnetic signature of the battlefield changed. The data suggests that on this day, Ukraine activated a new network of fire control radars operating in the X-band and C-band spectrums, likely linked to the Patriot system. Unlike the floodlight of the S-band, an X-band radar is a laser pointer. It has a much shorter wavelength, which provides much higher resolution. It doesn't just see a blob, it sees the fins on the missile. It can distinguish a $20,000 drone from a $3 million ballistic threat instantly. This clarity allowed Ukrainian commanders to see through the Russian noise. But seeing the target is only step one. Step two is killing it. The psychological and physical impact of the January 19th failure cannot be overstated. When the Russian Federation launches an Iskander-M or a Kinzhal hypersonic missile, they are utilizing weapons that travel at terminal velocities exceeding Mach 6. For years, the standard air defense systems provided to Ukraine relied on a mechanism known as blast fragmentation. This is the traditional method used by systems like the Soviet-era S-300 or early Western donations like the IRIS-T. A defensive missile flies near the Russian target and detonates, spraying a cloud of shrapnel. Against a fragile aircraft or a subsonic Russian cruise missile, this works. The shrapnel shreds the engines or control surfaces. However, against a hardened Russian ballistic missile, diving at hypersonic speeds with a reinforced casing, shrapnel is often insufficient. Even if a Ukrainian interceptor successfully detonates near a Russian Iskander, the momentum of the Russian warhead is often too great to be arrested by small metal fragments. Think about the physics. A 2-ton object moving at Mach 6 has immense inertia. If you damage it with shrapnel, you might deflect it slightly. But a damaged Russian warhead that tumbles into a Ukrainian residential block is still a catastrophe. Gravity is absolute. The kinetic energy of falling Russian debris is lethal, even if the fuse fails. This limitation in terminal ballistics, the inability to completely arrest the momentum of Russian heavy missiles, was the primary reason for the interception failures we saw on January 19th. The Ukrainian defenses were hitting the Russian targets, but they were not stopping them. But on January 20th, the equation changed. The data implies that Ukraine fully integrated the Patriot PAC-3 MSE into the fight, and with it, they introduced a new law of physics to the engagement: hit to kill. This shift in technology fundamentally altered the interaction between Russian offensive capabilities and Ukrainian defensive measures. The Patriot PAC-3, now the cornerstone of Ukraine's high-tier defense against the Russian Federation, does not rely on a proximity fuse. It does not rely on a cloud of shrapnel hoping to scratch a vital component of a Russian delivery system. It utilizes direct, body-to-body impact. In the engineering world, we often compare this to hitting a bullet with a bullet. But in the context of the Ukraine-Russia war, it is more akin to stopping a freight train with a solid wall of tungsten. The physics here are governed by the formula for kinetic energy: 1/2 mass times velocity, squared $E, K equals frac 1, 2 MIV, $2, because the closing speed between a Ukrainian-launched Patriot and an incoming Russian Kinzhal or Iskander is hypersonic, often exceeding Mach 7 combined. The velocity variable is massive. When you square that velocity, the energy release is exponential. When the Ukrainian crews guide a PAC-3 into physical contact with a Russian missile, they do not just break it, they vaporize it. The kinetic energy transfer is so violent that the materials of both the American-made interceptor and the Russian target undergo an instantaneous phase change. They are converted from solid metal into superheated plasma and dust. This is the only way to guarantee that a Russian warhead does not reach its target on Ukrainian soil. It ceases to exist as a coherent object. However, the engineers at Lockheed Martin, anticipating the ruggedness of Russian military hardware and the evasive maneuvers of Russian missiles, accounted for the margin of error. They included a failsafe known as the lethality enhancer. This is a critical component that separates the PAC-3 from other systems in the Ukrainian arsenal. The lethality enhancer consists of a ring of tungsten cycloids, heavy metal fragments surrounding a small explosive charge. If the Ukrainian guidance computer calculates that the interceptor will not achieve a perfect nose-to-nose impact against the Russian maneuvering target, if it is going to be a glancing blow, the lethality enhancer detonates. Milliseconds before impact, it sprays these heavy tungsten weights into the path of the Russian missile. Unlike standard shrapnel used in older systems, these tungsten weights are designed to increase the cross-sectional area of the kinetic strike. They ensure that even a grazing hit transfers enough energy to shatter the structural integrity of the Russian ballistic warhead. The result for Ukraine is not a damaged Russian missile falling on a Kyiv apartment complex. The result is a cloud of debris that burns up in the atmosphere. The Russian threat is not diverted, it is erased. This specific technology allowed Ukrainian crews to achieve that massive spike in kill rates against Russian ballistic targets on January 20th. They weren't just shooting, they were atomizing Russian hardware. This represents a technological overmatch where Western precision defeats Russian velocity. But effective physics is only half of the equation. A war is not just fought with kinetic energy, it is fought with capital. This capability comes at a premium price, which leads us to the second, equally critical part of this anomaly: the economics of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. We have established that the physics of the Ukrainian interception are sound, the engineering works. But in a war of attrition, physics is secondary to economics. Ukraine can win the tactical engagement and still lose the strategic war if they go bankrupt doing it. This brings us to the cost-exchange ratio. For a long time, this ratio was Ukraine's greatest vulnerability and the Russian Federation's greatest advantage. The Russian strategy has been to bankrupt the Ukrainian air defense network by forcing them to expend expensive interceptors on cheap targets. Let's look at the numbers. A single Patriot PAC-3 MSE interceptor supplied to Ukraine by its Western partners costs approximately $4 million. Conversely, a Russian Shahed 136 loitering munition, mass-produced by Russia and its allies, costs approximately $20,000. The math is brutal. If Ukrainian forces fire a $4 million missile to destroy a $20,000 Russian drone, they have successfully defended the target, but they have lost the economic exchange by a factor of 200 to 1. This is unsustainable. If the Russian Federation can produce drones faster and cheaper than Ukraine can acquire distinct, high-tech interceptors, Ukraine will eventually run out of financial backing, and then they will run out of missiles. On January 19th, the low interception rate suggests that Ukraine was hesitating. They were likely rationing their high-end missiles, fearing that if they engaged the swarm of cheap Russian drones, they would have nothing left for the heavy Russian ballistic missiles. This hesitation led to the 11% interception rate. The Russian saturation attack worked. However, the January 20th anomaly indicates a massive shift in doctrine. The data implies that Ukraine did not just receive more Patriots, they successfully integrated a tiered air defense architecture to counter the Russian swarm efficiently. To achieve a 92% overall kill rate against a mixed Russian strike package without going bankrupt, Ukraine cannot use Patriots on everything. They must segregate their fire. They must match the cost of the defense to the cost of the Russian threat. This concept is called fire control discipline. It means that while the Patriot radar sees the entire Russian attack, the Patriot launchers only engage the high-value Russian ballistic missiles. They ignore the cheap drones. So, who kills the drones? This is where the German-supplied Gepard systems and mobile fire teams come into play. These systems use radar-guided cannons to fire 35mm rounds. A burst of ammunition from a Gepard costs a few $100s. When Ukraine uses a Gepard to destroy a Russian Shahed drone, the cost-exchange ratio flips in Kyiv's favor. On January 20th, we saw this stratification in action. The high-value Patriot missiles were reserved exclusively for the high-threat Russian Iskanders and Kinzhals. The low-cost anti-aircraft guns were unleashed on the low-cost Russian drones. By correctly assigning the right weapon to the right target, Ukraine neutralized the Russian economic advantage. They stopped the bleeding of their own treasury while maximizing the destruction of Russian assets. But there is a technical hurdle here that is often overlooked. How does the Gepard know where to shoot if its own short-range radar is turned off to avoid detection by Russian anti-radiation missiles? This integration is incredibly difficult to execute in real time. It requires a unified command network where different radar systems talk to each other instantly. The fact that Ukraine pulled this off on January 20th suggests that Western data link technology, likely Link-16, has been fully operationalized within the Ukrainian command structure. Link-16 is a military tactical data link network. It allows a Patriot radar, sitting safely 50 kilometers behind the front lines, to detect a Russian drone swarm. The Patriot does not fire. Instead, it beams the precise track data heading, speed, and altitude directly to the digital display of a Gepard commander hiding in a tree line near the target. The Gepard crew doesn't even need to turn on their search radar. They simply slew their turret to the coordinates provided by the Patriot, wait for the target to enter visual range, and fire. This is silent engagement. It allows the Ukrainian defense to be lethal without revealing its position until the very last second. This level of digital integration is what allowed the separate layers of the defense to act as a single organism on January 20th. However, even with perfect physics and perfect digital integration, there remains one final variable: industrial logistics. The anomaly of January 20th was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that a well-supplied, well-integrated Ukrainian defense can withstand the full weight of a Russian aerospace attack. But it also highlighted the precarious nature of this defense. It is a system that runs on a constant influx of capital and advanced technology. We must look at the time to replenish metric. It takes Lockheed Martin in Arkansas approximately 2 years to manufacture a Patriot PAC-3 MSE, from raw materials to final assembly. It takes the Russian Federation approximately 3 months to manufacture a batch of Shahed derivative drones or Iskander missiles using their mobilized war economy. The supply chain for Ukraine is long and fragile. It stretches from factories in the United States, across the Atlantic Ocean, through logistics hubs in Poland, and finally onto railcars into Ukraine. The Russian supply chain is short and robust, stretching from factories in the Urals directly to the launch sites near the border. The events of January 20th prove that the Russian strategy of saturation is not invincible. It has a counter, but that counter is fragile. If the West stops supplying Patriot missiles, the high-altitude shield collapses, and Russian ballistic missiles will again strike with impunity. If the West stops supplying ammunition for the Gepards, the low-altitude shield collapses, and cheap Russian drones will overwhelm the expensive Patriots. The Russians know this. They will adjust. They will change their launch patterns. They will try to find new ways to break the economic ratio. The data from January 20th is encouraging for Ukraine, but it is not a final victory. It is simply a successful iteration in a long, grinding algorithm of attrition. Ukraine has proven they can solve the physics. They have proven they can manage the economics for a single day. The question now is whether they can sustain this efficiency for another year of war against a mobilized industrial power. This is Force Ratio. Make sure you are subscribed to track the mathematics of this conflict.